just given the context here, so obviously I work for the town of Morinville, and I think we've had no experience with wildfires to date. But in terms of my function here, it's primarily in regards as director on the Economic Developers of Alberta, and as that part of that organization, we've been working with municipalities and helping in terms of that the business communities kind of prepare for disasters, and also to support those during a disaster. And in particular, we work quite closely with the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo in 2016, and through our experiences with High River and other locations, we developed a toolkit, disaster preparedness toolkit that's available online. And we also established the hotline, telephone hotline, that was actually just located right next door, in fact. And through that hotline, we were able to identify over 4,000 businesses and disperse $3 million that were funds that was dedicated through the Canadian Red Cross back to those local businesses, and then working quite closely with regional municipality to try to help them kind of get back up and running. So that's kind of the take that my perspective I'm going to be coming here, and obviously both of our municipalities that are represented here are going to be providing different perspectives. In terms of the overall flow or context, we're really going to be looking at it from the sense of preparedness, and then in terms of what happens during the event. So kind of working through the resiliency piece, right through to recovery, and then after the recovery piece, and how long that kind of extends for, when you kind of get back to business as usual, as it were. So I'm going to pepper them with questions, and really put them on the spot here. And additionally to what we'd ask if you could as well. So if you think of something along the way, what basically we're going to do is kind of in those kind of 4 thematic areas that I mentioned, we'll kind of try to kind of end cap each of those 4 thematic areas with questions from yourself as well. But so if you think of something, make sure just to pipe up, and we want this to be as engaging as possible and as much of a learning experience. So with that being said, I'm going to fire this out. That's not a very good pun. I fired this up. That's not good. Off to a good start. That's excellent. let's make light of the disaster. Okay. So anyhow, so in terms of preparedness, and this is one of those questions that we haven't prepared in advance, which is kind of funny. But I'm just going to throw this at these guys. It's a bit of a curveball, but kind of a bit of an icebreaker as well. So in terms of preparedness, looking back, just if you can speak to your level of preparedness. And maybe like on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being like not prepared at all to 10 being completely prepared, how would you rate your community, and where were you at that time? So in terms of that preparedness piece.
I'll certainly say it wasn't a 10. I think, in all honesty, it was probably around a 5. There were things that we just couldn't anticipate. I feel a lot of questions from a lot of different reporters from all over the world about FireSmarting, and how dare I not FireSmart the city, and things of that nature. And what people need to understand, that the city was FireSmarted. There was a perimeter. However, this fire was moving incredibly fast. It jumped a river that was 1 kilometer wide. So my response to a lot of those questions were, we could have done a lot of things, and a lot of things may not have helped. But I think because our community is so safety oriented with the oil sands, it's paramount for them. I think that's what really brought us to that level 5. I think we've certainly learned a lot, and of course Erin can speak to this as she's directly involved with a lot of it. But I think we were probably around a 5.
I would agree, saying we were probably about a 5. I think from the FireSmart perspective too, you really have to have the council buy-in, and it has to be like a fabric of your community. So if there's a lot of funds going towards other things, that sometimes, unfortunately, those are the types of items that get cut. And then from a community perspective, I think the reason that Fort McMurray was able to evacuate was because of our younger community and the dynamic of how Fort McMurray works. But just after the fire, knowing, who here's read their insurance policy? That'd be a really great question, because I can tell you now, I've actually read mine from cover to cover, and when they renewed, I phoned them, and there's one clause 10.8, and I phoned and said, hi, as per clause 10.8, I need to phone you every 3 years and update my building costs. And they're like, sorry, what clause? So just, I think people don't really realize that kind of stuff, and from that community perspective, until you've gone through it, what you really need to do, what you need to understand, and how you can really be prepared for these types of events. So I don't think anybody will ever achieve a 10, but I would say what we've learned now, we're certainly getting closer. We're moving up the scale.
And I would say that the Lesser Slave River, we were also both a 5. We would have been lower, but we had a couple of fires. Both 2001, we had a big one that wiped out part of a hamlet, Chisholm, big Chisholm fire. And then we also had one in 2008 that almost made it to another hamlet. But because we have very good firefighters, it was stopped before it burnt any buildings. So there was that fire was a wake-up call, and so there was some preparedness, but not to the level that, not a 10 for sure.
Yeah, 5 was the magic number for me as well. Say maybe 4. A big one for us was our interurban wildland firefighting. That hadn't come together to the degree it has now. So a big one for us was when that breached the forest into the town, we didn't have the fittings for the fire trucks to get water. So just things like that were a big setback, but we did have a regional fire service at that point, and that was really important for us.
It's interesting. So you both of you can touch on 2 different things. First off, you indicated that given the scale and the importance of industry in the region, obviously there's like a pretty high level of emergency preparedness just as part of that industry. So it's going to assist in that.
Huge. The oil sands were certainly helpful, and I think that's a bit of an understatement. With their firefighting services, with their ability to move dirt, with their equipment, and their ability to house people. So without them, I'm not sure what would have happened. One of the things that I personally experienced that we don't have, and you might be able to speak to this very well, is business recovery. A lot of your emergency response plans don't speak to business recovery. They talk about containing the situation and making sure that it's safe, but ours particularly had nothing in there for business recovery. So that's why the hotline was so important. We won an award for that. But understanding how business gets back up and running, because it's so important, is really crucial. And of course, I was just at an economic development conference a few months ago, and that was really key, was that we need to start thinking about that. It's one thing to have people move back in, but it's kind of nice for them to have some grocery stores to shop at when they move back in. So things like that are things that I really think we all should be thinking about as well.
That's an interesting point. Are you saying that on the business side, it has been an evolution, I think, certainly for the Economic Developers of Alberta and also the Economic Developers Association of Canada. And in part, it has to do that each scenario tends to be a little more unique. And what the common thread tends to be is that those municipalities or jurisdictions that don't have a business license, for example, really don't have a database. And there's a lot of them. And in fact, counties tend to be kind of the larger groups that are just remiss in terms of having a business licensing structure. And one of the first things we did in Morinville, actually, about 4 years ago, is we restructured our business license application and make specific reference to the value of that business license relates to disaster preparedness. So, for the $100 fee you're being charged, this is actually going into a system. So it's not just communicating with you on an ongoing basis in terms of training programs and opportunities. It's looking at it in context of, hey, now we have a database, now you're sectorally based, we know your geographic location, we have emergency contact information, and then we can kind of get you up and running. And one of the lessons learned actually at Ohio River was that there was numerous businesses that had that information been available, those businesses could have been not only saved, but also been recovered faster. Butcher shop in particular, he had a generator in the back, right? It was easy. Everyone was trying to reach him and get in contact, and could have turned the generator on and saved all his inventory. Well, no, lost all the inventory, huge insurance claim, and kind of go back to that process. So, yeah, it's an interesting piece in terms of understanding how to kind of keep the businesses operational, and then obviously what are critical businesses, and then trying to get those back online. So, and Jill, you guys mentioned in yours that I think it was the 2001. It was kind of a near miss. It was some sort of a wind event or something that kind of pushed it off or minimized the threat level. So from that experience, that kind of triggered then in terms of where you're at in terms of the existing infrastructure, but also the more technical elements like the fitting you were talking about. So the quick lesson learned on that one, the near miss, I guess, in terms of kind of being prepared.
Schaun, if I can just add a comment about business licensing. If anybody's going to take the time to redo their business licensing, just make sure you do have that emergency contact, because typically on your business licensing information, they provide the number of the business. So when people are evacuated and you're trying to bring them back to the city, you don't actually know how to get in contact them. So we spent a significant amount of time trying to get a hold of everyone to bring them back to the community so they could be part of our re-entry. But you have to be able to get a hold of them, figure out who the contact is, get their emails, all those types of things. So it's really great if you have a different contact number or email or whatnot than just the business line, because if you're evacuated, there's no way to call those people, because in theory they've been evacuated as well.
That's an excellent point. Something I didn't mention is actually the off-site storage of that information, right? So also cloud-based, and Greg, who's here, might not know this, but Greg's my boss, and he might not be aware that I actually have a USB stick at home with all the business licenses on it. In the event of, okay, well, it's probably, I don't live in Morinville, right? I live in St. Albert, so if there is an event in the community, well, then I can kind of start engaging it actively immediately, right? And start tapping into our chain in terms of the phone tree to kind of start contacting back out. So good points.
Yeah, and we had one of the people we interviewed for this presentation. They had, when the fire started, the power went off, and it came back a few hours later. But they were in the middle of, cooking. There was a Tim Hortons. Their stoves were on. They had the water running, and the reason they reached the people who owned Tim Hortons was because their son was on the fire department. So they could ask for permission to enter to turn it off. And if not, damages would have been much higher.
Interesting points. Yesterday, I'm not sure how many participated in the design charade that took place in this room yesterday, but in regards to the here in Calgary and just looking at South and 9th Avenue and bordering the Elbow River, and it's kind of a classic design charade. It's like, well, we know this is a flood zone, and Marcus came in and he's the watershed guy in the city of Calgary, and he's doing all this mapping, and so the exercise was to say, okay, well, how do you then design for the inevitability that there is going to be a future flood in this area? Floods and water damage are a little different, of course, than in terms of wildfires. So maybe you guys can kind of just speak in terms of the, how do you utilize planning for disaster preparedness when it comes to wildfires?
Is very carefully an answer?
Well, it's a short one.
It's, I guess, just trying to have some foresight, which we didn't have a lot of, to be honest. It was very much status quo. Development has to move on, permits, ASPs, things like that. So understanding the neighborhoods, one of the biggest, and I use this story all the time because it really caught me so off guard that I almost didn't know how to react. Through the fire and the demolition process, all of the survey monuments were destroyed. So literally the land was just kind of floating around with no boundary. So when rebuild was to happen, there was no lot parameters anymore. So it's okay. Once I stopped screaming and trying to figure out how am I going to rebuild when I don't have any lot boundaries, there is a process in case you want to just write a letter to the minister. The minister tells his director of surveys to go do it. But it's kind of understanding what those, I guess, consequences are should things like that happen. Whether it's, one of the things you obviously don't think about either is slope stability issues when all of the trees get burned and there's nothing holding that bank together. On top of which, you probably all know that waterways, which was in the downtown Fort McMurray, it's all in the floodplain. So we had one issue after another just pounding against us where we're trying to get people back in houses as quickly as possible. But should we had some foresight through our FireSmarting and through preparing ourselves for that stuff to understand how we deal with those things and have a plan in place prior to that happening certainly would have helped.
I think to add to that too, I think we all now design communities with, multiple accesses or egress routes, but we all have those older communities in town. So we had a number of them that didn't have any emergency access routes, one way in, one way out. So now we're adding those, but had we thought of that or knew about that or even considered it before, we would have had multiple access that you didn't have people just, basically driving over to the highway or using an old trail or using a back landfill access to be able to evacuate that would have helped those people evacuate well. So just, I know we do it going forward now, but thinking about your older communities as well as some of the things you can put in place to make it a lot easier when an emergency does hit.
It's a very good point, Erin. People were just bailing, leaving all of their possessions in their cars and running. A couple that I know personally, she was 8 months pregnant, running down a hill because they couldn't get anywhere. And one of the eeriest things when I came back, so I evac'd on the 3rd and I was back on the 6th. it was just all these vehicles just abandoned everywhere, sides of the hill, on the road. Buses were in the median, just completely abandoned. So that's actually a very, very insightful point. You need to be able to get in and out, not just the city. We do have one way in and one way out, but we have a lot of neighborhoods that literally have 2 lanes in, 2 lanes out. That's it.
And when the fire hit in Slave Lake, it was not one fire, it was 3 fires. And it's just called a flat top complex because it was the 3 attacking from different sides. And so when people were evacuating, the cars they had to drive and they had to fire 100 meters away, but it was so hot it was like sitting in an oven on their way out, and they were just hoping that the tires would last past the fire. And another thing to be prepared is the landfill situation, because it's a lot of garbage. So how do you prepare for bringing back so many freezers and fridges and full of rotting meat, and it's in a bear habitat?
Adding on to what Anne's saying too about the landfill, even how do you deal with demolition permits? Like, we all do demolition permits normally, but what happens if you puncture a propane tank with a backhoe or ammunition that hasn't exploded? Thankfully now I know that very, I think, useless information that I didn't think I'd ever need to know, but those are the types of things that I think probably delayed even our demolition, because you were trying to figure out all these unknowns. If one house just burns down, they can typically give you that information, but when you have this mass cleanup going on, considering those types of things is just stuff you never thought of even considering.
We spent weeks in rooms just trying to safeguard every possible consequence, to the point where we just had to stop and see, occupational health and safety are around, and that's why they're here, and that's what these developers and contractors, that's what they do. So at some point we have to stand back and let them do their job and not take on some of that liability. So just like Erin said, I never thought I'd spend 2 days talking about a propane tank burning in somebody's foundation, but it happened.
So, yeah, I'll just add a quick bit there. For us, big one as well was the one-way in, one-way out subdivisions. And some of our subdivisions were completely cut off and couldn't get out. Dry hydrants were in addition to a lot of our subdivisions since the fire. That's for the fire departments where we don't actually have a water line out there for them to hook up to near the rivers or lakes. And an issue in the build within the subdivisions after there were issues mostly in town was the relaxation of fire codes and building codes on the houses. So we actually relaxed a lot of those building codes so that houses could be built either the way they were before, or just to get the process going, and that in turn has just increased our risk for future fires and having a worse fire come through again if that were to happen. So those were some of our issues.
It's curious, you mentioned something really interesting in terms of the psychological element. So, regardless if you're in a floodplain or if you're in a fire zone, you're still going to build out there. Given that interesting element of psychology, how do you help residents prepare for disaster? And in your case, in terms of fire, what are the tools at your disposal, or perhaps awareness campaigns? Like, how do you help them prepare?
We have, as part of our FireSmart money that we got from the government, we do have a team that educates, and they go specifically towards the children. So they have, because if you can reach the children, you can also reach adults. And then, there are sessions for adults too, to be aware of fire smarting your community, and we have one that got the Community Fire Smart Award or recognition. So it's lots of awareness campaigns and education. That's a big component.
But FireSmart is only one tool. And I think when you look at the big picture, you can't just rely on FireSmart, because what happens is that they'll do it if you're not a utility, which tends to want to do it more often. you see an awful lot of growback, because what happens is that most jurisdictions, all of a sudden it's the issue of the day. So money is freed up, go like hell, FireSmart all the communities, then we're done. But they forget that communities grow. They forget that there's maintenance that goes with it. And they forget that there are people who would say, well, I don't want you to FireSmart this so that basically it's going to be an ATV traffic route. And then there are wildlife considerations that all fit into the equation. But right now, and I'm curious, have they reacted going, quick, get out there, FireSmart again, go out, and this time we're going to put two more layers of defense in instead of having just one? Has that been part of the reaction?
You're very right, Ian. It's just much more than FireSmarting, and it's that maintenance of some of that dead underling stuff. I mean, I can see just personally, just from being in the trail system, and thank God the fire didn't get into the internal trail system of Fort McMurray, because it was a tinderbox. Well, we would have lost the whole city. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, they're in there, they're gutting it and FireSmarting and making sure that there's no fuel in there. But had it gotten in there, and Erin, you may be closer to that than I am, but it would have been incredibly sad, because we wouldn't have anywhere to go. I don't think it would have taken the whole city out.
I think the whole issue of FireSmart is you need to remember there's 7 disciplines within FireSmart. It's not just about the vegetation management piece. So it's the education, it's the interagency cooperation. So we now we used to have a FireSmart committee. It used to be, I think, called the Wildland Interface Committee. Now it's called the Regional FireSmart Committee. The government of Alberta is sitting on it. Our fire department's sitting on it. Our recovery team is sitting on it. The fire districts are all on it. So it's really about changing that idea and changing the fabric of your community and your thought of it, and really remembering that it's not just vegetation management. Yes, you can go and cut down all the trees, which we're doing, and we're working. But then we have other areas where we FireSmarted as a fire break during the fire, and I can't tell you how many calls I get a day saying, when are you putting my trees back? I bought a house that backs onto trees. I can't believe that you're just going to put seed in here. This is outrageous. But then on the flip side of that, okay, now that my trail's no longer in trees, can you cut down a few more trees so my trail can weave in and out of those trees? So I'm kind of at a loss on that one, but it's really, I think it really goes back to the sooner you can do these and make it part of your community and part of the regular everyday. So now we have FireSmart Friday. So the recovery team, we all wear FireSmart t-shirts. There's reminders that go out to all the community every Friday about what FireSmart means, and it's more. I always thought it was all about cutting down trees, but what I've learned is it's more, it's really, cutting down trees is the probably the least one we should pay attention to in FireSmart.
And I would say something that we started after the fire was the Tri-Council. And so it's we have one First Nation in the town of Slave Lake, or very adjacent to, in between, and in the MD. And First Nations, because they're in a different, they're federal jurisdiction, so the chief was very, very upset that they were just told to get out and they didn't know what was happening, and they were left in the dark. And so that has been one thing that we have fixed after the fire. When we have our training for disaster training, they're always invited, and along with ATCO, and so we have an interagency training once a year.
Just to add on to that, I think one of the greatest things Slave Lake did is their 2 biggest people that were anti-FireSmart, completely anti-FireSmart, they were able to turn them, and actually it's those 2 people that are just now on your, their pictures are on your FireSmart trailer, I understand, because they're actually now the biggest advocates in the Slave Lake community for FireSmart. So it's really explaining it to the residents and getting that buy-in from all levels. Provincial governments, local councils, and then your residents.